Hello everyone. Today I will be discussing Adrienne Rick's poem Power. What we see is that this poem eulogizes the contribution of Madame Marie Curie as a researcher and how she is projected as a feminist role model in Adrienne Rick's poem. But before I move on to those segments of my analysis, I would start to discuss, I will start by discussing the force of language as a medium of power. Why? Because we see that this poetic language through which Madame Curie gets represented is also a medium by which Adrienne Rick is trying to reach out to a cross section of readers. Language primarily functions as a means to an end and vehicle of self expression. Now, language is theorized to exist as a system by itself, an apparatus that functions not simply as an instrument of human reason, but as a tool for human development. And what we see is that post structural theories of language was not an encroachment, and Rick used these theories of subjectivity and language to defeat a romantic suffering of socio-political pain, especially the affliction of being a feminist, and represents the concept of language to confront political and ideological power of discourse. We will start from this power of language and then we will move to the important models or symbols of power that are analyzed in the poem. What we see is, before I move on to the poem proper, first let me start by explaining the political backdrop. We see that this poem was written around 1974 during the most politically charged second wave of feminist movements, which began in the 1960s. And the primary target of this movement was to increase women's equality. Adrienne Rick's poem Power is clearly was and is till date clearly a political statement. We see that in the second wave of feminism, first we need to locate Adrienne Rick. What is her position? And to briefly discuss her position, we must say that Rick was heavily involved in the second wave feminist movement, and she advocated for the needs and rights of women and LGBTQ community, lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual community. And from that perspective, Power is a creative work about the feminist movement and about female power and empowerment. Now, what the poem discusses? We see that the poem discusses the famed physicist and chemist Marie Curie. Today, Curie is known for her self sacrificial work with radium and radioactivity, which she discovered. Curie was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize and till date, is the only person to have won Nobel Prizes in both chemistry and physics. Given that Curie lived and died in the late 1980s and early 1900, such accomplishments are contextually stunning. Why? Because as women during these centuries were still politically, socially, and intellectually oppressed. Rick treats Marie Curie as a symbol of female power, given her numerous scientific accolades and her fearless ability to rally against the social and political conventions of the age. Rick also uses Marie Curie as the subject of her poem, given that Curie died in 1934 from, as you can see, aplastic anemia, a direct result of her groundbreaking work with radioactive materials. So, what we see is that it is sadly ironic twist of fate. It was Curie's life work and greatest accomplishment that also killed her. In the poem, Rick contemplates what this says about the nature of power. Now, coming to the poem. The poem has been received as a meditation on woman's power. And what we see is that Rick urged her readers to exert their power quietly but mightily as a way to advocate for global change. This global change is very essential because at this time when I am recording this video or this PowerPoint, we see that we are undergoing the various influences of this global change because of this pandemic. And at every juncture, we need to face certain crises and we need to change the entire mode of life and existence. Now I will move on to the poem. What we see is that an unnamed speaker tells a brief anecdote about how a backhoe. What is a backhoe? It is basically an excavating machine unearthed an old bottle of liquid. And this bottle is a relic of the past. It is one of those quack sciences, so-called magical bottles of tonic that was advertised back in the day as the solution to all humankind's problem. Then the speaker suddenly shifts gears. And we see that she tells us that she was reading about Marie Curie earlier in the day. Perhaps she is drawing a contrast between Curie and the seller of tonics. These quack doctors for generations have been the male members of society who have been selling a big hoax to us. And Madame Curie represents someone who, for the sake of truth, for the sake of world development, for the sake of development, gave up her life. The speaker imagines that Curie understood her radiation sickness better than anyone else, though she denied it. There is a sense of denial in the poem, which draws our attention to the tension between what Curie knew and what Curie would admit to the world. In the final stanza, coming to the final stanza, we see that the speaker slowly and powerfully tells us that Curie died a famous woman all while denying that her ailment was caused by radium, the source of her power. If we move on to the poem, let us move on to the poem. Living in the earth's deposit of our history, today a backhoe divulged out of the crumbling flank of earth, one bottle amber perfect, 100 years old, cure for fever or melancholy, a tonic for living on this earth in the winters of this climate. Remedy to all our problem. Suddenly we see that there is a shift. Today I was reading about Marie Curie. As I told, I am reading out from the poem. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness. She must have known. Her body bombarded for years by the elements she had purified. Body bombarded by the elements she had purified. See, look at the point. In the sense, for the sake of humanity, she sacrificed her own body. It seems she denied to the end the source of the cataracts on her eyes, the cracked and suppurating skin of her finger end, till she could no longer hold a test tube or a pencil. She went on denying. Why? Because the power, the source of power, also devastated her life. And she never acknowledged that. Why she never acknowledged that? Because she felt that whatever she was doing for the sake of humanity. She died a famous woman denying her final wounds. This is a very important line. You can do something from your own wounds. Your wounds teach you to do something new or to do something innovative. Maybe you have to sacrifice your life, maybe you have to put down your life, but from your wounds only you can do something which will bring about a glory to human civilization. Her wounds came from the same source as her power. See, this is radioactivity or radiation exposure that Adrienne is talking of. But I will analyze this in a different way. What? A woman. What is her source of power? She is the only individual who is capable of giving birth. She is capable of giving life. But that very passage or that very passage through which life is generated is the most vulnerable point of her body, which had been continuously suppressed and have been subjected to violence by patriarchal society. So what we can see is that the strength of her woman is also the source of her wound. But in spite of having the wound, she must carry on. She must carry on for the sake of humanity. And what we see is that even Marie Curie carried on for the sake of humanity. So what we see is that this 17-line poem, it reflects on woman's history and specially famed chemist and physicist Marie Curie. It focuses on Marie Curie, and through Marie Curie it focuses on every woman's history. It focuses on woman's history and on every woman's history. The poet considers all the various medicines developed as tools for living on this earth. In the first paragraph, we saw that in the first stanza of the poem. Curie's discovery in this field would eventually lead to treatment for cancer, but the cost was high. There was an irony to Curie's death, the narrator admits, given that the source of her power and scientific political impact was the very same thing that ultimately killed her. So what we see is that in this way, the narrator reveals that woman's power often comes directly from their wounds. Now, if you remember, I started the poem by discussing the notion of language. See, Madame Curie's contribution is represented to us through the powerful language of Adrienne Rick. So what we can see is that within the text we see a role model, Madame Curie. But we cannot undermine the overall structure of the text. The overall structure of the text, which is wrapped in language, actually helps in establishing a certain point. What we see is that poetry at times becomes, at psychological levels, and at times becomes a defense mechanism. In order to live and exist in the world, the poet must radicalize and subvert the language which installs subjectivity. This I narrate from Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom has famously told this. Now what we see is that Rick also used the post-structural theories of language to engage and expose the ideologies of patriarchal power that suppressed not only her identity, but the identity of each and every woman. And we see that she is making this poem not only based on a role model, but she is also making this poem a language centered poem that talks about the apprehensions of new mode of thinking and new feminist ways. What we see is this poem, it actually tries to assimilate a feminist theory to an aesthetic literature. And the poem becomes a site not only of exploring one role model, but the poem also becomes a site of contestation that destabilizes, decentralizes, and tries to deconstruct the patriarchal discourse. And what we see is that in this poem, the language of poetry enforces the imbalances that family, history, society, and culture create on woman, create on woman. And language, which comes from the word logos, is always conceived to be from the male point of view. But here we see that by putting forward a new role model of Madame Curie, Adrienne Rick is trying to give us new directions regarding how feminist discourse can be formulated by eulogizing feminist role models. And to do that, we must unearth the female body, and we must try to locate the female body within the text, which had long been a site of absence in patriarchal discourse. Thank you.